The Perplexing Parrot's Final Words, a Miss Marple Mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a parrot, clever, talkative, and far more observant than anyone believed. For years, it repeated fragments of conversations, dismissed as harmless mimicry. But on the night its owner died under suspicious circumstances, the parrot spoke a sentence it had never uttered before. The villagers called it coincidence. Miss Marple did not. She notices the timing, the choice of words, and the sudden silence that follows. Those final words were not random sounds, but a memory, spoken at the exact moment it mattered most. And as Miss Marple listens carefully, it becomes clear that the bird may be the only witness to a crime someone thought could never be proven. Because sometimes, the truth is repeated, waiting for someone clever enough to understand it. Before we uncover what the parrot truly heard, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Perplexing Parrot's Final Words. The village of Stonemere prided itself on silence, not the empty kind, but the comfortable silence of routine sounds repeated so often they became invisible. The soft crunch of gravel beneath early morning shoes, the distant clatter of milk bottles being set down, the steady chiming of the church clock marking time as it always had. Nothing in Stonemere ever startled anyone, which was precisely why the voice that rang out from Rosewood Cottage that autumn morning froze the village in place. "Do not tell her. Do not tell her." The words were spoken clearly, with careful emphasis, each syllable crisp enough to cut through the cool air. They did not sound frantic or wild, but controlled, almost practiced. A moment later, silence returned, heavier than before, as if the village itself was unsure whether it had imagined what it heard. Miss Jane Marple stood at her kitchen table, one hand resting on the edge, the other holding a teacup she had forgotten to lift. Her keen eyes shifted toward the window, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Years of quiet observation had taught her that trouble rarely announced itself loudly, but when it did, it often disguised itself as something harmless. A parrot, for example. Rosewood Cottage lay 2 houses down from Miss Marple's own, tucked behind a tall hedge that had grown wild despite repeated trimming attempts. The cottage belonged to Mr. Harold Finch, a man of polite manners and reserved habits, who had arrived in Stonemere 5 years earlier with a modest inheritance and a noticeable desire to be left alone. He kept no close friends, attended church irregularly, and spoke only when spoken to, except to his parrot, a large grey bird named Solomon, known throughout the village for its unsettling habit of repeating private conversations with uncomfortable accuracy. Miss Marple had encountered Solomon only once, during a brief visit to Rosewood Cottage after Mr. Finch had taken ill the previous winter. The bird had watched her with sharp eyes, head tilted, feathers smooth, and had spoken not a single word in her presence. That restraint, Miss Marple remembered, had bothered her more than chatter ever could. Outside, doors began to open cautiously. Mrs. Turner from the bakery leaned into the street, flour still dusting her sleeves. Mr. Collins paused mid-step with his bicycle, one foot on the pedal, listening intently. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. Everyone knew the voice had come from Solomon, and everyone also knew that parrots did not invent sentences. They only repeated what they had been taught. Miss Marple placed her teacup down, reached for her cardigan, and stepped outside. She moved with unhurried calm, though her mind was already working briskly. Words, she knew, were like loose threads, pull one gently enough and the entire pattern revealed itself. As she approached Rosewood Cottage, she noticed the front door stood slightly ajar. That alone was unusual. Mr. Finch was meticulous about locks and bolts, a habit he had once explained as a sensible precaution. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze lingering on the neat garden beds, the trimmed rose bushes, the absence of any sign of disturbance. Whatever had occurred inside had not spilled outward. From within the cottage came a faint rustling sound, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws against wood. Solomon appeared in the open doorway, perched on the back of a chair just inside. His head turned slowly, one eye fixing on Miss Marple, then the other, as though measuring her. "Too late now," the parrot said calmly, its voice eerily level. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She stepped closer, keeping her voice gentle. "Good morning, Solomon," she said, as though greeting a child. The bird blinked, feathers ruffling once, then settled again. "Do not tell her," Solomon repeated, slower this time, each word weighed down with meaning. Miss Marple glanced past the bird into the cottage. The hallway lay in shadow, quiet, untouched. "Where is Mr. Finch?" she asked, though she knew the bird could not answer such a question directly. Still, parrots had a way of responding indirectly, choosing words that had already been spoken. Solomon tilted his head. "She must never know," he said. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She had heard similar phrases before, not from birds, but from people who believed secrets could protect them. In her experience, secrets rarely did. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the gate. Mrs. Turner whispered behind her hand. Mr. Collins cleared his throat repeatedly. Someone suggested calling the constable. Miss Marple turned toward them, her expression composed. "Perhaps that would be wise," she said. "But there is no need for panic. Let us be patient." The constable arrived 10 minutes later, breathless from his brisk walk, and entered the cottage with visible caution. Miss Marple waited outside, her attention returning to Solomon, who watched the activity with unsettling calm. The bird did not scream or flap. It simply observed, as though it had already seen all of this before. When the constable emerged, his face had lost some of its color. He removed his cap, holding it tightly. "Mr. Finch has passed away," he said quietly. "It appears to have happened during the night." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Miss Marple felt no shock, only a deepening sense of certainty. Death, she knew, rarely arrived without preparation, and parrots, inconvenient as they were, often remembered the preparations better than the living. "How did he die?" someone asked. "We cannot say yet," the constable replied. "There are no obvious signs of struggle." Miss Marple's gaze returned to Solomon, who chose that moment to speak again. "You promised," the bird said softly. Miss Marple inhaled slowly. Promises, secrets, final words. She had learned long ago that the smallest witness often held the largest truth. And Solomon, perched quietly in the doorway of Rosewood Cottage, had heard something no one else had been meant to hear. Whatever Mr. Harold Finch had feared, whatever he had tried to conceal, had not died with him. It had learned to speak. And it was not finished speaking yet. Chapter 2: The Secret the Parrot Kept. By midday, Stonemere had slipped into the familiar rhythm it always adopted after unpleasant news, quiet efficiency layered over restless curiosity. Curtains twitched, kettles boiled, and conversations were lowered by half a tone, as if volume itself might disturb whatever lingered in the air after death. Rosewood Cottage stood closed and guarded now, its door firmly shut, the parrot cage covered with a dark cloth, yet the unease it had unleashed refused to settle. Miss Marple sat by her front window, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the constable move back and forth across Elder Lane. She had known many men like Constable Harris, earnest, practical, and slightly overwhelmed when events slipped beyond the tidy boundaries of rules and reports. He would note times, observe positions, and record statements, but it would not occur to him that the most important witness had feathers and a talent for remembering exactly what it heard. When he finally approached her gate, his steps slowed, as if he sensed he was entering a conversation he did not fully control. Miss Marple greeted him with a gentle smile that offered reassurance without promising agreement. "You wish to speak with me, Constable," she said calmly. Yes, Miss Marple, he replied, clearing his throat. Several villagers mentioned you were nearby when the bird spoke this morning. I wondered if you heard anything unusual. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Unusual is a matter of perspective, she said. I heard words spoken with intention, which is what troubles me. Constable Harris frowned slightly, notebook poised. The parrot, you mean? Indeed, Miss Marple said. Parrots repeat what matters to them, and what is repeated most often. One does not say do not tell her by accident. The constable hesitated. We have established that Mr. Finch died sometime between midnight and dawn. No signs of forced entry. No visible injury. The doctor believes it was natural causes, though he will not be certain until further examination. Miss Marple nodded. And yet, she said softly, natural deaths do not usually come with warnings. Constable Harris shifted uncomfortably. The bird is only repeating things it heard earlier. Precisely, Miss Marple replied. The question is when. Later that afternoon, permission was granted for Miss Marple to visit Rosewood Cottage under supervision. The constable remained by the door as she stepped inside, her gaze moving slowly across the familiar yet altered space. Death had a way of rearranging rooms without moving a single object. Mr. Finch's chair sat beside the fireplace, untouched, his spectacles folded neatly on the side table. Everything spoke of order, of control, of a man who disliked chaos. The parrot cage stood near the window. Solomon remained covered, silent now, though Miss Marple sensed rather than saw his alertness beneath the cloth. She approached the cage and paused, her hand hovering briefly before lifting the cover. Solomon watched her intently, eyes bright, posture rigid. You came back, he said. Miss Marple did not react outwardly. Good afternoon, Solomon, she replied evenly. You have had a busy day. The bird shifted its weight. Too much talking, it said. That can be a dangerous thing, Miss Marple agreed. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, not because she feared being overheard, but because she wished to create the illusion of privacy. Tell me, Solomon, when did you hear those words this morning? The parrot was silent for several seconds. Miss Marple had learned patience from years of listening to people who did not know how much they were revealing. Last night, Solomon said finally. Miss Marple felt a tightening in her chest. Who said them? Solomon ruffled his feathers. He did, the bird said. He was angry. Miss Marple glanced toward the door, where Constable Harris stood watching, his expression neutral but attentive. Was anyone else there? She asked. The parrot cocked its head. She was, it said. Miss Marple straightened slowly. And who is she, Solomon? The bird's voice dropped, imitating a whisper with eerie accuracy. She must never know. The constable stepped forward. Miss Marple, he said quietly. We cannot rely on a bird for testimony. No, Miss Marple replied gently, but we can rely on it for direction. The name that emerged later that evening surprised no one and unsettled everyone. Miss Eleanor Finch, Harold Finch's niece, arrived in Stonemere just before sunset, her black coat buttoned tightly, her face composed in the practiced manner of someone accustomed to controlling her emotions in public. She claimed she had received a message early that morning informing her of her uncle's passing. No one could say who had sent it. Miss Marple watched her from across the lane, noting the stiffness in her posture, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward Rosewood Cottage before settling elsewhere. Grief, Miss Marple knew, often revealed itself in the smallest betrayals of habit. At the cottage, Eleanor Finch stood before the parrot cage, her hands clenched at her sides. It should not be allowed to speak, she said sharply. That bird repeats nonsense. Miss Marple studied her face. Nonsense is rarely repeated so clearly, she said. Eleanor's gaze hardened. My uncle was ill. He said many strange things. Did he say those things to you? Miss Marple asked. For a fraction of a second, Eleanor hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple saw it. No, she said. He was confused. From beneath the cloth, Solomon spoke again. You promised, the bird said. Eleanor Finch recoiled as though struck. Make it stop, she snapped. Please. Miss Marple felt the shape of the truth beginning to emerge, fragile but persistent. Promises made late at night, secrets shared in anger or fear, words spoken aloud and remembered forever by a creature with no understanding of mercy or discretion. That night, as the village settled uneasily into sleep, Miss Marple lay awake, replaying the day in her mind. She did not yet know what Eleanor Finch had promised, or what Harold Finch had feared would be revealed, but she was certain of one thing. The parrot had spoken its final words not as a warning to the village, but as a reminder to one person in particular. And whatever secret lay buried in Rosewood Cottage was pressing upward, determined to be heard. Chapter 3: The Parrot's Final Confession. Morning returned to Stonemere with reluctant light, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over a village that had failed to sleep. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, watching mist drift slowly across Elder Lane, thinking not of death, but of fear. Fear was always the true cause of secrets, and fear, when left unattended, had a habit of poisoning everything around it. Rosewood Cottage reopened under supervision shortly after 8. Constable Harris arrived first, followed by the doctor, and finally Miss Eleanor Finch, who moved with rigid determination, her face composed yet strained, like glass held too tightly. Miss Marple joined them moments later, her presence quiet but unmistakable. She carried nothing with her except patience, which she knew would soon be required. Inside the cottage, the air felt heavier than before, thick with unspoken tension. The parrot cage stood uncovered now. Solomon watched the room with calm alertness, his head turning slightly as each person entered. His eyes settled on Eleanor Finch, and he made a low clicking sound that caused her shoulders to stiffen. Miss Marple took a seat near the window. Before we proceed further, she said gently, there is something that must be understood. Mr. Finch did not fear death. He feared exposure. Eleanor Finch's lips tightened. That is speculation, she said. My uncle was a private man. Privacy, Miss Marple replied, is not the same as secrecy. The doctor cleared his throat. I have completed my examination, he said. Mr. Finch died of heart failure, but there were contributing factors. He had taken a substance that placed severe strain on his heart. Constable Harris looked up sharply. Poison? Not directly, the doctor replied. A stimulant, administered in small amounts, but enough to worsen his condition. Silence settled over the room. Eleanor Finch stared at the floor. He took medicine, she said. He was careless. Miss Marple folded her hands. Careless men do not usually repeat warnings aloud, she said. Nor do they argue with themselves late at night. Solomon spoke suddenly. You said it was safe, the bird said. Eleanor Finch gasped, a sharp sound she failed to control. Stop it, she whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. When did he say that, Solomon? After she came, the parrot replied. Voices were loud. Constable Harris stepped closer. Miss Finch, he said quietly, were you here last night? Eleanor hesitated. The pause was long enough to be noticed, short enough to be revealing. Yes, she said finally. I came to speak with my uncle. About what? Miss Marple asked. Eleanor's composure fractured. About the will, she said. He planned to change it. He wanted to leave everything to charity. Miss Marple nodded. And you objected? I reminded him of his promises, Eleanor said sharply. He owed me. Solomon spoke again, his voice unnervingly calm. You promised, he repeated. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Harold Finch raised you after your parents died, she said softly. He supported you, educated you, and later discovered that you had been taking small amounts of money from his accounts. Eleanor looked up, panic flashing across her face. He forgave me. Yes, Miss Marple said, but forgiveness does not erase fear. He feared you would continue, that exposure would ruin you, and that the truth would come out after his death. Constable Harris inhaled sharply. The stimulant, he said. You gave it to him. I did not mean to kill him, Eleanor cried. I only wanted him calm, willing to listen. Miss Marple met her gaze. Fear does not care about intention, she said. It only waits for opportunity. Solomon shifted on his perch. Do not tell her, he said one final time. Miss Marple stood. Those were his last words to himself, she said. Not a warning to the village, but a desperate plea that the truth would remain buried. Unfortunately for him, he entrusted his fear to a witness who could not forget. Eleanor Finch sank into a chair, her resistance gone. The constable placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Outside, the village waited, unaware that the mystery had already resolved itself quietly, without drama, exactly as Miss Marple preferred. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned home, pausing briefly by her garden gate. She could hear Solomon inside the cottage, now silent, his duty completed. Secrets, she reflected, had a way of choosing their own moment to surface, and when they did, even the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth. That evening, Stonemere returned to its routines, comforted by the illusion of peace, while Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served not by force, but by listening, which was, she believed, always the better way. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, and you want more classic village secrets, quiet confessions, and cases where the smallest detail changes everything, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next mystery is already waiting to be heard.